A crown gleams in the torchlight. A cradle rocks in the shadows, and between them lies a question no dynasty ever dared to answer out loud. When the heir becomes a threat, how far will a ruler go? Tonight, we open the blood-stained scrolls of history where emperors strangled their princes, queens blinded their heirs, and kings offered their sons to the fire. These are not fairy tales. These are the real thrones where love was a liability and fatherhood ended with murder. Welcome to 30 royals who murdered their children. Before we dive headlong into this parade of crowns and coffins, take a moment to subscribe. It helps keep the torches burning in these midnight corridors of history. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what hour of the night or morning finds you wrapped in the glow of these stories? Constantine the Great. History likes to remember Constantine as the man who baptized an empire. The first Christian emperor, the man who legalized the faith that had once been fed to lions, the man who supposedly saw a vision of the cross in the sky and took it as his divine marching order. But empires are built on more than miracles and martyrdoms. They're built on blood. Sometimes the blood of enemies, sometimes the blood of family. In Constantine's case, that blood came from his own son. The son was Crispus Bright, talented, and, if we believe the court historians, everything a Roman heir was supposed to be. He was young, successful on the battlefield, praised by senators, adored by soldiers. In other words, dangerous. Because when you're the son of an emperor who is himself trying to invent the perfect legacy, your competence can look less like a blessing and more like a coup waiting to happen. The details are maddeningly murky, as most dynastic murders are. Some whisper that Crispus had been accused of treason. Others claim he was caught up in court intrigue, framed by his stepmother Fausta, who may have had her own ambitions for her children. Another version suggests a twisted affair between Crispus and Fausta, whether real or invented, that gave Constantine the excuse he needed. The result was the same. In 326 AD, Constantine had Crispus executed. His son, the boy who carried his name forward, the young man who was supposed to inherit the empire, gone. The irony is thick enough to choke on. The man hailed by the church as equal to the apostles killed his heir in what looks very much like paranoia disguised as justice. And it didn't end there. Not long after Crispus's death, Fausta herself was killed, allegedly suffocated in an overheated bath on Constantine's orders. If Crispus had been guilty, why execute Fausta? If Fausta had been guilty, why execute Crispus? The contradictions don't line up neatly, which is exactly how imperial court politics worked. The records were deliberately messy. Confusion was a weapon. Constantine lived on, spreading the gospel of his personal brand of Christianity, while never answering for the most unchristian of acts, murdering his child. And maybe that's why the story lingers like smoke in the rafters of history. Because you don't get sainthood and filicide in the same biography unless humanity itself is the contradiction. And that contradiction, how a man could sanctify an empire and strangle his own bloodline, isn't an isolated case. Byzantium would prove that the Christian empire still had plenty of appetite for killing its children. Which brings us to a woman who ruled by the cross and blinded her son in the name of power, Empress Irene of Athens. By the time Irene seized the Byzantine throne, she had perfected the art of survival. Born into the crumbling elegance of Athens, she married Emperor Leo IV, and after his death, served as regent for their son, Constantine VI. On paper, it looked like a noble arrangement, the dutiful mother guiding her child until he was old enough to reign on his own. In practice, Irene had no intention of handing over the keys to the empire. Constantine VI was not Crispus. He wasn't dazzling, he wasn't adored, and he wasn't particularly competent. But he had one thing Irene didn't: a legitimate claim as emperor. The Byzantines, fond as they were of pious hymns and ritual, still understood power in bloodlines, and so long as Constantine lived, Irene's reign was always provisional, always conditional. That kind of uncertainty is poison to a ruler who craves permanence. At first, she tried the usual methods: co-rule, manipulation, staged councils that declared her authority divinely sanctioned. But when Constantine began to grow restless under his mother's shadow, rebellion stirred. Factions of the military rallied to him, chanting his name, dreaming of a young emperor who could lead armies into glory rather than a woman who led them into bureaucracy. In 797, Irene ended the question once and for all. Her son was seized, dragged into the palace, and subjected to the most Byzantine of punishments: blinding. Not execution, not exile, blinding. Because to blind a rival was to erase his political future without technically spilling imperial blood. It was the kind of cruel legalism only Byzantium could invent, a neat loophole where maternal murder didn't count as murder. But Constantine didn't survive long after the ordeal. A blind emperor was no emperor, and in a world without antibiotics, infected wounds often did what the executioner's axe could not. Irene had killed her son, and with him, the last shadow of male legitimacy blocking her way. She crowned herself Basileus, Emperor, not Empress, because she ruled not as a consort, but as the sovereign in her own right. The chroniclers, of course, recoiled. To them, Irene's act wasn't just a filicide, it was an inversion of nature, a mother who devoured her child to sit on the throne. And yet, the same chroniclers couldn't resist acknowledging her intelligence, her skill at navigating a treacherous empire, her ability to outplay patriarchs who underestimated her. Which is what makes her story so haunting. Was Irene a monster? Or merely the inevitable product of an empire where survival meant striking first, even at your own offspring? She may have crowned herself with the language of empire, but the shadow of her blinded son crowned her legacy with something darker. The empire had seen mothers grieve their children before. Now it saw one deliberately extinguish hers. And if the Byzantines thought this was an exceptional case, they were wrong. Across the Bosporus, in a new empire rising from the Anatolian frontier, another ruler would look at his son and see not a successor, but a threat worth killing: Murad I. The Ottomans began as frontier warriors, raiding and conquering in the shifting chaos left by the Mongols and the Byzantines. By the time Murad I took the throne in the 14th century, the Ottomans were still more tent than palace, more sword than law. But even in this warrior culture, dynastic paranoia had already taken root. Murad's son, Savki Bey, was not content to wait quietly in the wings while his father carved out an empire. Like so many heirs in so many dynasties, Savki looked at his father's crown and thought, why not me? In 1373, he revolted. He wasn't alone. He actually joined forces with the son of the Byzantine emperor, staging a joint rebellion against their respective fathers. It was a bizarre alliance. 2 princes, 2 thrones, one dream of patricide. But revolts are tricky things, especially when you're fighting the man who taught you how to fight. Murad crushed the rebellion, captured Savka, and was faced with the same question every ruler in this cursed lineage faced: forgive the son and risk rebellion again, or eliminate him and secure the throne. Murad chose elimination. Savka was executed. Accounts differ on the details. Some say strangulation, the Ottoman favourite. Others hint at more elaborate torments. What they agree on is that Murad killed his son for daring to reach too high. The father secured the empire by cutting off his own branch of it. The Ottomans would later formalize this logic into law. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, codified the grim principle. whichever of my sons inherits the throne, it is fitting that he should kill his brothers for the sake of the order of the world. But Murad was there first, proving by action what would later be written in law in the Ottoman dynasty. The father's love was always conditional, and the son's loyalty was always suspect. So here we have Constantine, Irene, and Murad, 3 rulers from 3 different worlds, each proving that the family tree of empire is less tree and more execution scaffold. And if you think Murad's strangling of Savku was brutal, wait until you see what happened a century and a half later, when another Ottoman sultan killed his son in full view of the army, turning a beloved prince into a corpse in the name of order. Suleiman the Magnificent. They called him the lawgiver. They called him the Magnificent. He expanded the Ottoman Empire to heights it had never seen, conquering, legislating, building mosques so grand that the skyline of Istanbul still trembles with them. His reign is often described as the golden age of the Ottomans, the high water mark of their glory. And yet, even in a golden age, the iron hand of suspicion could still close around a son's throat. Literally. The son was Shehzadi Mustafa, the crown jewel of the dynasty. Born of Suleiman and his concubine Mahidevran, Mustafa was groomed from the start as heir. By his 20s, he had a reputation not just as a prince, but as a soldier's prince. Charismatic, fearless, generous with rewards, Mustafa was the kind of commander who inspired loyalty from men who would rather die than retreat. The Janissaries adored him. And that, right there, was the problem. Because Suleiman was not only a father, he was an emperor. And an emperor looks at a popular son not just with pride but with terror. A beloved heir is also a potential rival, a magnet for conspiracies, a walking opportunity for those discontented with the current regime. Suleiman's own court was already a nest of vipers. Rival mothers in the harem jockeyed for their children's advancement. Advisors whispered poison into the sultan's ear. And the most dangerous whisperer of all was his legal wife, Harem Sultan. Harem was no ordinary consort. She was a political operator of the highest order, bending the rules of the Ottoman harem until she shattered them. She wanted her own sons to inherit the throne, and Mustafa's popularity was an existential threat to that dream. Did she plant rumors in Suleiman's ear? Almost certainly. Did she manipulate documents, arrange false witnesses, exaggerate treason? We cannot prove it with certainty, but the circumstantial evidence piles high. By 1553, the tension broke. Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent during the Persian campaign. The soldiers loved Mustafa so much that they shouted his name when he rode into camp. They thought the meeting would be a reconciliation, perhaps even a handover of supreme command. What they got instead was theatre of the cruelest kind. Mustafa entered his father's tent. He bowed. He waited for the embrace of authority. Instead, he was seized by eunuchs and strangled with a bowstring. The army outside was stunned. The most popular prince in the empire had been murdered not in secret, not in some dungeon, but in the very presence of his father, the man they called Magnificent. Panic rippled through the soldiers. Some wanted to mutiny, but the iron machinery of the Ottoman state was too strong. Mustafa's body was displayed, lifeless, and with it, the dream of a beloved soldier emperor died. Suleiman continued to rule for decades afterward. The empire still called him Magnificent. He still built, legislated, conquered. But in his final years, the consequences of Mustafa's death revealed themselves in the bitterest way possible. His surviving sons, the products of Hurrem's ambitions, turned out to be disappointing. Selim II, his chosen heir, was more interested in wine and concubines than in ruling. Historians often call him Selim the Sot. The once great empire survived his reign by sheer momentum, but the rot had begun. So, Suleiman killed the son who could have kept the empire strong, all because the shadow of suspicion outweighed the promise of loyalty. The lesson is as brutal as it is familiar. In a dynasty, a father may be willing to sacrifice the very future of his empire to secure his present rule. And Suleiman was hardly the first ruler to learn that lesson. A century earlier, in the cold stone halls of Moscow, another sovereign's paranoia would erupt not through careful executioners with bowstrings, but with the raw, impulsive violence of his own hands. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV of Russia. The name says it all. Historians don't need to embellish it, though the chronicles tried. He was the first to call himself Tsar of all Russia, and he believed it with the conviction of a prophet. To him, the state and his soul were fused, indivisible. To betray him was to betray God. To oppose him was to court damnation. And yet, the man who struck terror into all of Muscovy could not control the one emotion that destroyed his dynasty: rage. His son, also named Ivan, bore the weight of impossible expectations. Tsarevich Ivan was dutiful, intelligent, and, unlike his father, had a streak of compassion. He tried to temper the brutalities of court life, intervening for peasants and voicing sympathy for boyars who fell afoul of the Tsar's wrath. That may sound noble, but in a world ruled by suspicion, kindness looks a lot like weakness. The fateful day came in 1581. Accounts differ in detail, but the consensus is chillingly consistent. An argument erupted. Some say it was about the Tsar's pregnant daughter-in-law, whom Ivan the Terrible allegedly assaulted or struck. Others suggest it was about military decisions or succession planning. Whatever the trigger, rage consumed Ivan IV like dry straw catching fire. He struck his son with his iron staff. It was not a slap, not a symbolic blow of anger, but a crushing strike that left the air bleeding on the floor. The chroniclers describe what came next with grim poetry. The Tsar, realizing what he had done, cradled his dying son in his arms, weeping, wailing, begging forgiveness. The son, loyal even to the end, may have murmured absolution before the light left his eyes. Father and heir, sovereign and future. One broken in a moment of rage, the other broken forever by it. The famous painting by Ilya Repin, centuries later, captured the scene with almost unbearable intensity, an emperor whose entire soul seems to realize, too late, the horror of what he has done. It is one of the most famous images in Russian history. Ivan the Terrible, wide-eyed and blood-stained, holding his dying son. A dynasty undone not by conspiracy, not by rebellion, but by one blow of uncontrolled fury. After Tsarevich Ivan's death, Russia's succession spiraled. Ivan IV's surviving son, Fyodor, was weak and incapable, leading to the time of troubles, that decades-long nightmare of famine, civil war, and foreign intervention. In other words, Russia's descent into chaos was triggered by a father's strike against his own child. A family tragedy became a national catastrophe. And yet, even in his regret, Ivan never stopped believing he was God's chosen scourge. The paradox of rulers is written here in blood. Even when they kill their children, they still see themselves as instruments of divine justice. Ivan's guilt did not make him gentler, it made him worse. But Russia was not alone in this paradox. To the west, in a far grander court, another great ruler would face the same crisis. This time, it would not be a blow of rage, but a slow, deliberate process of trial, imprisonment, and interrogation. The victim, a son accused of betrayal. The father, Peter the Great. Peter the Great. If Ivan IV embodied rage, Peter I embodied control. Or at least, he tried to. He towered above his courtiers. Literally and metaphorically, a man obsessed with dragging Russia into the modern world whether it liked it or not. He built streets, Petersburg on swamps, carved a navy out of nothing, forced his boyars to shave their beards and dress in western coats. He was a modernizer, a tyrant, and, like so many on this list, a murderer of his own blood. The victim was his son, Alexei Petrovich. Unlike his father, Alexei had little taste for ships, cannon, or reform. He was a traditionalist, drawn to the old Muscovite ways, suspicious of Peter's obsession with Europe. Worse, he was sympathetic to the very nobles and clergy Peter had alienated. To Peter, Alexei's reluctance looked less like personality and more like treason. The story plays out like a slow-motion tragedy. At first, Peter tried to mold his son into a proper heir. He berated him, shamed him, threatened him. Alexei, sensitive and hesitant, wilted under the pressure. Eventually, he fled abroad, seeking refuge in the Holy Roman Empire. For a Tsar, there was no greater betrayal, an heir who abandoned the homeland and consorted with foreigners. When Alexei was persuaded to return, Peter staged a show trial. The charges: treason, conspiracy, disloyalty. The evidence: flimsy, circumstantial, inflated by Peter's paranoia. But, in autocratic Russia, a trial was less about evidence and more about performance. Alexei was interrogated, tortured, forced into confessions, and then, before the final sentence of execution could be carried out, he conveniently died in prison. The official cause: illness. The real cause: beatings so severe that his body gave out. Peter had not struck in a moment of rage like Ivan IV. He had not summoned assassins like Suleiman. He had orchestrated a legal machine that chewed his son to pieces while maintaining the veneer of justice. That was Peter's genius. Modernization and brutality fused. Russia's new legal codes, its European-style reforms, its rational bureaucracy, all of it could still be bent into a tool for filicide. And just as with Ivan and Suleiman, the consequences rippled outward. Peter had no worthy heir left. The succession after his death was chaotic, passing between daughters, grandchildren, and pretenders. The empire he built on order plunged into dynastic disorder because the man who sought to build a future had destroyed it with his own hands. Father kills son, son dies unloved, unlamented by the throne. The empire staggers on, weaker for it. The story repeats itself so often that it begins to feel like ritual, like some secret oath every emperor takes. I will kill what I most need, to prove that I fear nothing. But if the story of Peter shows us the cold, bureaucratic murder of a son in the name of progress, the next ruler on our list shows us something older, more brutal, almost biblical. Because long before Russia, long before the Ottomans, there was a king of Judea who murdered not one, not two, but 3 of his own sons in the name of paranoia. Herod the Great. Herod is remembered by Sunday school teachers as the king who tried to kill the infant Jesus. But long before the gospel stories painted him as the archetype of paranoid tyranny, he had already rehearsed the role with his own bloodline. If you want to understand Herod, forget the manger, forget the magi, forget the star in the east. Focus instead on his sons, because for Herod, fatherhood was not a tender embrace, it was a battlefield. Herod had many sons, too many. With multiple wives, he created a small army of heirs, each backed by different noble families, different factions, and different ambitions. The Roman overlords who had installed him as king of Judea weren't exactly handing out parenting manuals. They didn't care about family harmony. They cared about stability, and they expected Herod to maintain it. But stability was the one thing Herod could never achieve in his household. The first to fall was Alexander. Handsome, charismatic, and the son of Herod's Hasmonean wife Mariamne, Alexander carried a double threat. Not only was he Herod's son, but he had a pedigree linking him to Judea's ancient ruling dynasty. For traditionalists, Alexander looked like the rightful king. For Herod, that made him a time bomb. Whispers of treason circulated. Herod heard enough rumors, or pretended to justify the unthinkable. In 7 BCE, Alexander was executed. But paranoia doesn't end with one corpse. Aristobulus IV, Alexander's brother, was next. The logic was the same. Too much popularity, too much Hasmonean blood, too many people murmuring that perhaps Herod was only the Romans' puppet, while Aristobulus carried true legitimacy. Again, Herod chose survival over kinship. Aristobulus was strangled, 2 sons gone. The third was Antipater, Herod's firstborn and originally his favorite. For years, Antipater maneuvered as heir apparent, flattering his father while quietly feeding him lies about his half-brothers. But in the end, even the favored child could not escape the paranoia he had helped nurture. Once Herod discovered Antipater's plots to accelerate his own accession, some sources say even to poison his father, the king had him executed just days before Herod himself died. 3 sons, 3 deaths. Crispus died at the order of Constantine. Constantine VI was blinded by Irene. Savki Bey was strangled by Murad. Mustafa died in Suleiman's tent. Ivan was felled by his father's staff. Alexei collapsed under Peter's interrogations. And now, Herod's systematic, relentless stacked the bodies of his children, one after another, as though building a macabre monument to his own insecurity. What made Herod particularly monstrous is that he killed his heirs while simultaneously clinging to the idea of dynasty. He wanted a line that would survive, but he destroyed the very bloodline that could have secured his throne. He wanted to be remembered as Judea's great king, but he ensured his descendants inherited only suspicion and instability. The irony is that the man who murdered 3 sons for threatening his power is now remembered primarily for attempting to murder someone else's, a child born in a manger, heralded by angels. Herod's legacy is that of a killer of children. That is how the world remembers him. And yet Herod was not unique. In Persia, centuries before him, another king also heard whispers of conspiracy from his own flesh and blood. His name was Artaxerxes, and his son's name was Darius. And in the bloody ledger of royal paranoia, their story deserves its own chapter. Artaxerxes II. The Achaemenid Empire had no shortage of plots. It was a sprawling dominion, stretching from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, where satraps governed provinces like miniature kings, and the palace was never free of intrigue. Artaxerxes II reigned for nearly half a century, which by ancient standards is astonishing longevity. But longevity does not come without casualties, especially in one's own household. His son Darius was the crown prince, the hope of continuity for the empire. But Darius was impatient. In royal courts, impatience translates easily into treason. Encouraged by factions who thought the old king too weak or too slow, Darius allegedly plotted to overthrow his father. Whether the evidence was solid or fabricated hardly mattered. What mattered was that Artaxerxes believed it, or allowed himself to believe it. The punishment was swift and merciless. In a court where disobedient satraps were skinned alive and traitors impaled, a rebellious son could expect no mercy. Darius was executed. Some accounts claim Artaxerxes himself cut his throat, a grotesque inversion of the father's hand once guiding the child to life. Imagine the symbolism. The king, who saw himself as father of the empire, literally slaughtering his own son with the same detachment he showed toward rebellious provinces. Why did he do it? Partly because paranoia is hereditary to monarchy. Partly because every father king sees his son as both heir and rival. And partly because the Persian court was a theatre of constant betrayal. Darius's downfall was as much about factions as about filial love. When nobles whisper that your son wants the throne, do you trust your son or your nobles? Artaxerxes trusted his fear. Darius's death didn't secure the empire forever. After Artaxerxes, Persia stumbled, its vastness increasingly unmanageable, its heirs quarreling like jackals. When Alexander the Great arrived with his disciplined Macedonian army, the Achaemenid dynasty collapsed within a generation. Perhaps if Darius had lived, the Persians would have been stronger. Or perhaps not. But the what if haunts the story. A father who killed the son who might have saved the empire. It is almost poetic, the way empires destroy their own future by destroying their own children. Persia was no exception. And neither was the Black Sea kingdom of Pontus, where another king, one infamous for poisoning, paranoia, and sheer theatrical cruelty, did the same. His name was Mithridates, and his son Zephyrus paid the price. Mithridates V. Mithridates the Great, the king of Pontus, was obsessed with survival. Legend says he dosed himself with poisons every day to build up immunity, a living experiment in toxicology. He was the great thorn in Rome's side, waging 3 long wars against the Republic and dreaming of carving out a new Eastern Empire. He was cunning, ruthless, and suspicious to the point of mania. If he didn't trust his generals, why would he ever trust his son? Zephyrus was caught between his father's endless wars and his mother's shifting loyalties. At some point during the conflict with Rome, Zephyrus sided with his mother and defected to the enemy. In Mithridates' world, this wasn't just betrayal, it was treason of the highest order. His son had chosen the Romans, the very people Mithridates defined his entire identity against. The punishment was as cruel as it was symbolic. Mithridates had Zephyrus executed. Some say he watched. Some say he ensured the body was displayed in grotesque fashion to send a message not just to his court but to Rome itself. No one, not even my son, may defy me. The irony. Mithridates had trained his children to be suspicious, to be ruthless, to survive by cunning. And then, when one of them played the game too well, or perhaps too poorly, he slaughtered him. The father of poisons poisoned his own bloodline. Pontus did not survive long after Mithridates. Rome swallowed it whole, as Rome did with everything. The king who killed his son to assert his dominance could not keep his kingdom alive. It is another refrain in the grim song of dynasties. The father who murders the child murders the future as well. 3 fathers, Herod, Artaxerxes, Mithridates. 3 sons, 3 corpses, 3 legacies, built on betrayal. And yet, the chorus continues, because even as the Romans rose, other kingdoms followed the same ritual of blood. In Armenia, a king called Tigranes would face his own rebellion of sons, and once again, the executioner's hand would be turned inward. Tigranes II. Tigranes the Great of Armenia, king of kings, the man who briefly carved out an empire between Rome and Persia, is remembered as a conqueror in gilded relief. His armies marched deep into Syria, Cappadocia, and Mesopotamia. His court shone with Persian pomp and Hellenistic elegance. For a moment, Armenia looked like it could stand as a third great power alongside Rome and Parthia. But empires don't collapse because of enemies alone. Sometimes they rot from within. Sometimes the battlefield isn't at the gates, but in the nursery. Tigranes had many children's sons who grew restless under his long reign. Some sources say he favored certain sons, others hint he distrusted them all. What is certain is that at least one of his sons rebelled. Whether inspired by Roman promises, driven by ambition, or emboldened by factions at court, the prince turned against his father. And Tigranes, like every other monarch we have met on this grim tour, chose steel over forgiveness. The rebellion was crushed. The son was executed. Some accounts say more than one met this fate, that multiple sons fell victim to Tigranes' paranoia. The details blur, as ancient accounts often do, but the pattern is clear. In a time when empires were little more than extensions of their rulers' egos, a son who reached for power was treated as a rival, not a child. The irony is almost comedic in its cruelty. Tigranes had fought against Rome for years, only to finally bow to Roman dominance after his empire began to crumble. Yet while he spared Rome his final defiance, he did not spare his own blood. The foreign enemy could be bargained with, bought off, even respected. A son, however, that was personal. Too personal to forgive. What did Armenia gain from this filicide? Nothing. After Tigranes' death, Armenia slipped back into the status of buffer state, tossed between Roman and Parthian influence. The great Armenian Empire, that brief flicker of independence, faded into memory. And one cannot help but wonder whether, if Tigranes had trusted his heirs instead of executing them, Armenia might have stood longer. But kings seldom imagine that their dynasty will be weaker without sons. They only imagine themselves safer without rivals. It was a pattern we've seen before and will see again. The king kills his son to secure the throne, only to weaken the dynasty in the process. And nowhere is that pattern more grotesque than in Egypt under the Ptolemies, where family love had been reduced to an experiment in cruelty. Ptolemy VIII Physcon. Of all the dynasties in history, the Ptolemies of Egypt may have taken the prize for sheer operatic dysfunction. Brothers married sisters, sisters poisoned brothers, nephews murdered uncles. And in the middle of this grotesque carnival of incest and betrayal sits Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, meaning the fat. His cruelty, however, was heavier than his waistline. He came to power by outmaneuvering his siblings, as all Ptolemies did, and immediately set about securing his throne in ways that make Suleiman's strangling of Mustafa look merciful. His most notorious act of filicide was the murder of his son, Ptolemy Memphites. The story reads like theatre written by a sadist. Cleopatra II, Physcon's sister wife, had rebelled against him. Their marriage was collapsing under the strain of endless mutual betrayals. But Physcon didn't just punish Cleopatra, he punished her through her child. Memphites was taken, murdered, and then dismembered. The pieces of his body were delivered to Cleopatra on her birthday. Imagine it. The child you bore, mutilated, wrapped up as a grotesque gift from the man who had once shared your bed. This wasn't just filicide, it was psychological warfare. Physcon wanted to make his enemies not just his wife, but anyone tempted to support her feel sickened, terrified, broken. He didn't just kill his son, he weaponized his son's corpse. The Ptolemies had long blurred the line between dynasty and theatre, between family and state, but Physcon crossed into something darker. He revealed what dynastic politics really were, not love twisted into cruelty, but love eradicated altogether. Children were pawns, expendable symbols in a game where the only rule was survival. What became of Egypt after this display? Decline. The dynasty lurched forward, weakened by endless civil wars and the corrosive distrust Physcon embodied. By the time Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, lover of Caesar and Antony, appeared, the dynasty was staggering toward its death under Roman conquest. The murder of Memphites was not an isolated act. It was a symptom of a sickness that doomed the dynasty, the belief that the throne was worth more than the blood that carried it. And yet, even as Egypt collapsed, farther west across the deserts of North Africa, another dynasty was rising. Morocco would produce one of the most ruthless rulers in Islamic history, Moulay Ismail. His court was infamous for cruelty, his empire built on fear, and his treatment of his sons followed the same logic that had driven Herod, Tigranes, and Physcon before him. Moulay Ismail. Moulay Ismail of Morocco reigned for over half a century, one of the longest reigns in history. He was called the Warrior King, the man who solidified Morocco as a unified state, fought off European incursions, and filled his palaces with such extravagance that travelers compared them to Versailles. But alongside his accomplishments ran a streak of cruelty so severe that even by the standards of absolute monarchs, it left contemporaries horrified. Ismail fathered hundreds of children, literally hundreds, with a vast harem of wives and concubines. Some estimates put the number above 800. You might think, with so many heirs, that Ismail could afford a little mercy when one disappointed him. But Ismail had no use for mercy. To him, sons were as disposable as soldiers. Zetian, one of his sons, fell out of favor. The reasons are debated, perhaps disobedience, perhaps political ambition, perhaps nothing more than bad timing. What is not debated is the outcome. Zetian was executed on Ismail's orders. Another son, Muhammad al-Alim, met a fate so grotesque it reads like a parable of terror. Ismail had him mutilated, blinded, and disfigured until the prince, unable to endure his broken body, took his own life. What kind of father does this? Perhaps the question is meaningless when applied to men like Ismail. He didn't see himself as a father in the human sense. He saw himself as an emperor whose bloodline was both blessing and curse. Sons weren't loved, they were liabilities. Too many of them meant too many rival factions, too many pretenders. By maiming and killing his children, Ismail wasn't lashing out in rage. He was pruning a tree he believed grew too many branches. The cruelty worked, at least in the short term. His reign was long and unchallenged. Morocco stayed stable, strong enough to resist foreign conquest. But what did it cost? After his death, the succession was chaotic, with multiple sons competing for the throne, distrust poisoning every relationship. The seeds of his cruelty bore fruit in instability. Ismail's reign is a chilling reminder that even a dynasty with countless heirs can destroy itself if the ruler sees his children not as continuity, but as rivals. The harem that should have secured his legacy instead produced a graveyard of potential kings. From Armenia to Egypt to Morocco, the theme is relentless. The throne demands blood, and the easiest blood to spill is your own. But if you think this sickness was confined to Africa or the Mediterranean, think again. Across the highlands of Ethiopia, another emperor once gazed upon his children and decided they were not heirs but heretics. His name was Zara Yaqob, and his dynasty too would be written in blood. Zara Yaqob. Zara Yaqob, emperor of Ethiopia in the 15th century, styled himself as the guardian of orthodoxy, a ruler chosen not just to govern, but to purify his empire of heresy. He reigned for more than 3 decades, an unusually long span for a medieval African monarch, and he left behind a reputation as both reformer and tyrant. To the faithful, he was a saintly enforcer of doctrine. To those who suffered under his purges, he was a terror cloaked in liturgy. For his children, he was something worse, executioner. Ethiopian chronicles record Zara Yaqob as a man obsessed with rooting out dissent. He convened councils, wrote theological tracts, and persecuted any group that wavered in its obedience to the Orthodox Church. He believed he was God's hand in flesh, smiting error with sword and fire. But when you rule as God's chosen instrument, every act of disobedience becomes a sin against heaven itself, even if that act comes from within your own household. The emperor's children were not immune to his paranoia. At least some of them were accused of harboring heretical beliefs, sympathizing with dissidents, or showing disobedience that could be framed as impiety. That was enough. Zara Yaqob ordered their executions, branding them enemies of God. Imagine the scene: a father cloaked in robes of sanctity, declaring his own blood unfit for life because they had supposedly offended the faith he embodied. It wasn't just filicide, it was filicide consecrated as holy duty. Why did he do it? Partly, perhaps, because he was convinced of his own righteousness. In Zara Yaqob's world, theology and politics were indistinguishable. To rebel against the emperor was to rebel against God. A child who questioned him was not a wayward son or daughter, but a heretic one, whose death could be justified with hymns and psalms. Yet there is something darker here. By killing his children in the name of orthodoxy, Zara Yaqob wasn't just protecting his throne. He was trying to cleanse his lineage, purify his dynasty by extinguishing the impure. In his mind, perhaps, their deaths preserved the sanctity of the family. In reality, it only revealed the contradiction of a ruler who claimed to defend divine order while unraveling the most natural order of all, a parent's bond to their child. After Zara Yaqob's death, Ethiopia endured turbulence, as dynasties always do when heirs are thinned by suspicion. His theological writings survived, venerated by some as sacred texts. His acts of filicide survived too, remembered not as holy justice, but as proof that even piety can mask cruelty. And if you think this contradiction between sacred fatherhood and lethal paranoia was unique to Ethiopia, think again. Across the sea, in Japan, another father, one far more pragmatic than pious, ordered his son to die not in the flames of heresy, but in the ritual of seppuku. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his son was Matsudaira Nobuyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu. Japan, in the late 16th century, was a world in chaos. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, had shattered the old order. Daimyo warlords fought endless battles, betrayals were routine, and the concept of loyalty was little more than a polite fiction. Out of this storm rose Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient, cunning, ruthless. He would one day unify Japan and establish a shogunate that endured for 2.5 centuries. But before that triumph, he had to sacrifice his son. Matsudaira Nobuyasu was born into ambition. He was Ieyasu's eldest son and therefore the natural heir to the Tokugawa clan. He married into the powerful Oda family, binding his fate to Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who was then on his way to dominating central Japan. On paper, Nobuyasu had everything: blood, alliance, and the future at his feet. But ambition cuts both ways. Rumors began to swirl that Nobuyasu's wife, Nobunaga's daughter, was unhappy, disloyal, or even treacherous. Some said she had denounced Nobuyasu to her father, accusing him of plotting rebellion. Others claimed Nobunaga himself, ever suspicious, simply decided that Nobuyasu could not be trusted. And when Nobunaga demanded his death, Ieyasu faced a choice that has haunted fathers and rulers alike: defy an ally and risk annihilation, or sacrifice a son to secure survival. Ieyasu chose survival. He ordered Nobuyasu to commit seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai. In 1579, the young man obeyed. He opened his own abdomen, his blood soaking the tatami, his honor preserved even as his life ended at his father's command. It was filicide by proxy, the father demanding the son kill himself, a paradox of honor and betrayal wrapped together in a blade's edge. What does this say about Ieyasu? On one hand, it proves his cold pragmatism. he placed the Tokugawa clan above everything, even his own bloodline. On the other, it reveals the fragility of alliances in Sengoku Japan. A whisper, a suspicion, a single demand from a powerful ally was enough to obliterate a child's future. And yet, the sacrifice worked. Ieyasu lived on, bided his time, outlasted Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally seized control of Japan. He founded the Tokugawa shogunate, which brought peace to Japan for more than 2 centuries. The cost of that peace was his son's life. But peace has its ironies. The Tokugawa dynasty later codified rules that made loyalty and filial duty central to samurai ethics. Imagine that. A system built on the principle of obedience, created by a man who had ordered his own son's death. In this, Ieyasu was not unique, because just a century later, another monarch ruling far across the sea in Korea would also command the death of his son. And this time, the son's death would be even more grotesque, not with a sword, but with suffocation in a rice chest. King Yeongjo of Joseon. 18th century Korea looked peaceful on the surface. The Joseon dynasty prided itself on Confucian order, rituals, hierarchy, respect for elders, filial piety, the whole symphony of stability. But beneath the surface, factional strife poisoned the court. Ministers schemed, relatives whispered, and paranoia festered like rot in a lacquered chest. For King Yeongjo, one of Korea's longest reigning monarchs, the poison seeped into the most intimate place of all, his relationship with his son, Crown Prince Sado. Sado was complicated. Accounts describe him as unstable, plagued by violent outbursts and paranoia of his own. Some say he roamed the palace, killing servants in fits of rage. Others paint him as a tragic figure, sensitive and intelligent, crushed under the impossible expectations of a Confucian father. Whatever the truth, father and son were locked in a spiral of mutual resentment and disappointment. Yeongjo believed his son was unfit to rule. Sado believed his father hated him beyond redemption. Both may have been right. In 1762, the tension broke. Factions in court pressured Yeongjo to act, warning that Sado's behavior threatened the dynasty itself. But Yeongjo could not simply execute the crown prince without tainting the throne. So he devised a compromise, if one can call it that. Sado was ordered into a large wooden rice chest, locked inside, and left to die. For 8 days, Sado suffocated, starved, and went mad within that wooden coffin. His family could hear his cries from outside, his scratching, his begging. His own mother later described the horror, her account a chilling record of how filicide can be cloaked in ritual and formality. When the chest was finally opened, the crown prince's body was there, broken and lifeless, the dynasty's future sealed shut with him. Yeongjo reigned for another decade, remembered by historians as a reformer who stabilized the kingdom. But in the shadows of that stability lingered the image of the rice chest, the place where a father had entombed his own child alive. Sado's death haunted Korea. His son Yeongjo eventually became king and tried to rehabilitate his father's reputation. Yet the trauma of the chest remained, a symbol of Confucian ideals twisted into cruelty. The dynasty survived, but the stain could never be washed away. From Ethiopia's religious zealotry to Japan's ritual suicide to Korea's rice chest, the theme repeats, a throne that feeds on its heirs. But our grim march is not over. In China, another ruler, the only woman to ever take the imperial throne in her own name, would be accused of the same crime. Zetian, Empress of China, would prove that even the hand that rocks the cradle can just as easily smother it. Zetian. China has seen emperors rise and fall for millennia, their dynasties marked by cycles of chaos, restoration, and decline. But only once in its vast history did a woman rise above every minister, every consort, every general, to proclaim herself emperor in her own right. That woman was Wu Zetian. Her name carries an aura of danger and fascination. Was she a genius stateswoman who stabilized a fracturing dynasty, or a ruthless usurper who murdered her way to power? Both are true. And in the dark ledger of her crimes sits the whispered accusation that she killed her own children. Wu Zetian entered the Tang court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. After his death, she became consort to his successor, Emperor Gaozong. That much is history. But the stories about her rise are tangled with suspicion, rumor, and venom. One such story concerns her infant daughter, born to Gaozong. The child died suddenly, smothered in the cradle. Ancient chronicles accused Wu Zetian of murdering the baby with her own hands, then framing the emperor's empress, Wang, for the crime. The scheme worked. Wang was disgraced and deposed. Wu rose to power. Did Wu really do it? Or was the accusation the invention of hostile historians who despised the idea of a woman wielding power? Modern scholars debate it endlessly. What matters for our purpose is that the charge stuck. Wu Zetian, mother and empress, was remembered as someone who killed her child to secure her place on the throne. But the tale doesn't end there. Later, when Wu Zetian became Dowager Empress, she maneuvered her sons onto the throne as puppet emperors. One of them, Li Xian, grew too independent, too defiant. He dared to assert authority that Wu herself considered hers alone. For that crime, he was forced to commit suicide. The empress, who had once been accused of smothering her infant, now silenced her grown son. The paradox is impossible to ignore. Wu Zetian justified her actions by invoking the mandate of heaven, claiming divine sanction for her rule. Yet heaven's mandate usually passed through the bloodline through sons. Wu inverted the pattern. Sons were not heirs, but obstacles. To preserve her dynasty, she undermined it. To secure the throne, she toppled the very foundation of succession. Wu Zetian reigned as emperor from 690 to 705, presiding over a flourishing of culture and administration. Her dynasty, briefly called the Zhou, though historians fold it into the Tang, was stable under her hand. And yet, the stories of her filicides became inseparable from her reputation. Even centuries later, she was remembered not only as the woman who sat on the dragon throne, but as the mother who may have killed her children. Her reign posed a question that has no satisfying answer. Was she a monster who destroyed her offspring for power, or was she merely playing by the same bloody rules that every emperor before her had played, except more openly? Either way, her shadow falls across history like a warning. Even motherhood can be weaponized against itself when the throne is at stake. And in the next chapter of our tour, we leave the Tang Palace to step into the colder halls of the Qing dynasty. There, another emperor would watch his son's ambitions grow and would respond not with embrace, not with encouragement, but with forced suicide. The Yongzheng Emperor, another father, another son, another death. Yongzheng Emperor. The Qing dynasty was built on conquest, forged by the Manchus who swept out of the northeast to rule all of China. By the 18th century, it had become the most powerful empire on earth, its palaces filled with silk, jade, and bureaucracy as intricate as a spider's web. Into this world stepped the Yongzheng Emperor, fourth son of Kangxi, inheritor of an empire both vast and fragile. He is remembered as a hard worker, a man who spent long hours reading petitions, issuing edicts, and refining the machinery of state. He is also remembered as a paranoid father who ordered his son to kill himself. The son's name was Hongxi, not the heir apparent, not the golden child destined to succeed, but a son whose alliances at court made him dangerous. Hongxi supported factions opposed to Yongzheng's chosen policies. He aligned with his brother, a rival claimant to the throne. In a dynasty where succession was the most dangerous game of all, this was enough to doom him. The emperor could not simply execute Hongxi outright. Such an act would have stained the dynasty's Confucian facade of filial piety and benevolent order. Instead, he did what emperors so often did when they wanted blood without the spectacle. He compelled his son to commit suicide. Hongxi obeyed. His life ended not by the emperor's sword but by the emperor's decree, which was no less lethal. The tragedy of Hongxi lies in its banality. He was not remembered as cruel, nor as brilliant, nor as rebellious. He was remembered only as another casualty of the paranoia that infects dynasties. His father reigned, his brother succeeded, and his name sank into the margins of history. For Yongzheng, it was just one more act of housekeeping, eliminating a rival to secure stability. For China, it was another reminder that dynasties consume themselves as much as they govern others. The empire continued to flourish, at least for a time, but the cost was one more son erased from memory, one more family scar hidden behind the lacquered walls of the Forbidden City. And so, the story continues. From Wu Zetian's smothering infants to Yongzheng silencing his son, rulers justified by heaven perpetually turned their knives inward. But if Confucian monarchs clothed their filicides in ritual, the kings of Judah in the ancient Levant committed theirs with fire, openly sacrificing their children to the flames of foreign gods. Which brings us to King Ahaz. Ahaz of Judah. The kingdom of Judah was small compared to the empires we've seen so far. A sliver of land caught between greater powers, it lived in constant tension between its ancestral faith and the seductive rituals of surrounding nations. King Ahaz, who reigned in the 8th century BCE, is remembered not for victories or reforms, but for a crime that horrified later chroniclers. He sacrificed his son. The Hebrew Bible tells us that Ahaz made his son pass through the fire, a phrase scholars understand as child sacrifice, likely to the god Molech. Whether Ahaz believed it would bring divine favor in war, or whether he was swept up in foreign rites, the act was remembered as a betrayal of Yahweh. For generations afterward, prophets and priests denounced him, holding up his sin as the reason Judah suffered invasions and humiliations. But imagine it from Ahaz's perspective. His kingdom was cornered, his enemies pressing on every side. In desperation, he may have turned to rituals that promised supernatural aid. What greater offering could he give than his own child? Kings gave their treasuries, their temples, their lands. Ahaz gave his son to the fire. To later Israelites, this act was unthinkable. The king was supposed to be the shepherd of his people, the guardian of the covenant. To kill his son was to desecrate both fatherhood and kingship. Ahaz's reign was forever tainted, his memory preserved not in triumph, but in condemnation. He became a symbol of what happens when a ruler turns the most sacred bond-parent to child into fuel for the flames. And yet, in Judah's history, Ahaz was not alone. Another king, his descendant Manasseh, would follow in his footsteps, sacrificing his son as well. It seems that in the crucible of ancient kingship, when enemies closed in and hope withered, even the most sacred life became expendable. From Wu Zetian's cradle to Yongzheng's decree to Ahaz's fire, the pattern continues. Power demands sacrifice, and the most horrifying sacrifices are often one's own children. And if Ahaz thought himself exceptional in this, history proved him wrong. For soon after, another king of Judah would follow the same path, offering his son to the flames and leaving behind a legacy of blood. His name was Manasseh, Manasseh of Judah. If Ahaz set the stage, then Manasseh, king of Judah in the 7th century BCE, carried the performance to its darkest climax. His reign lasted more than half a century longer than any other king of Judah, and yet his legacy was remembered less as endurance than as abomination. He ruled not as a reformer, not as a stabilizer, but as the monarch who plunged Judah into what later writers described as spiritual corruption. And at the heart of his reign was the sacrifice of his own son. The biblical chroniclers do not mince words. They accuse Manasseh of rebuilding pagan altars, erecting shrines to Baal and Asherah, and even placing idols inside the temple itself. They describe him consulting sorcerers and mediums, dabbling in divination, and leading the people into more evil than the nations that Yahweh had destroyed before Israel. And then comes the accusation that seals his infamy. He sacrificed his son in the fire. What drove a king, one born into the Davidic line and charged with protecting the covenant, to such a crime? Fear, desperation, or ambition dressed up as piety? Perhaps he believed that appeasing foreign gods would protect him from the Assyrian Empire, the superpower of the day. Perhaps he thought a child's death would guarantee prosperity for his reign. Or perhaps, like so many kings before and after him, he simply believed that his power justified anything, including filicide. The horror is not simply that a father killed his child, but that a king did so in ritual, turning his personal betrayal into public spectacle. A father who sacrifices his child for his own survival is monstrous. A king who does it as an example to his people makes the whole nation complicit. Later, generations blamed Judah's eventual downfall, its conquest by Babylon, the destruction of the temple, the exile of its people, on the sins of Manasseh. His filicide was not a private crime but the spark of collective punishment. And yet, even here, contradiction lurks. Some traditions claim Manasseh repented late in life, turning back to Yahweh and seeking forgiveness. If true, then the story becomes more unsettling, not less. Because repentance does not erase the crime. The child is still gone. The act is still done. Forgiveness may comfort the guilty, but it cannot resurrect the dead. The story of Manasseh is thus a parable of dynastic rot. The king who thought his throne could be secured by sacrificing his son, but who instead sowed the seeds of his kingdom's destruction. He mistook cruelty for stability, he mistook ritual for security, and he mistook his son's life for a bargaining chip in a game with gods who never played fair. But Manasseh's horror was not the final word. For in the neighboring kingdom of Moab, another king would commit the same unspeakable act. His name was Mesha, and his son's death became legend in both biblical text and stone inscription. Mesha of Moab. The Moabites were a small kingdom east of the Dead Sea, forever entangled with their more powerful neighbors Israel, Judah, Aram, Assyria. In the 9th century BCE, their king was Mesha. His reign is remembered not for longevity nor for prosperity, but for a single act of desperation that echoes across history. He sacrificed his own son on the city walls. The scene is set in the Book of 2 Kings. Israel, Judah, and Edom had allied against Moab, and Mesha was besieged. The armies pressed him hard, his defenses failing, his city on the brink of collapse, surrounded, outnumbered, desperate. Mesha turned to the gods, but unlike Ahaz and Manasseh, whose sacrifices were whispered of in chronicles, Mesha's sacrifice was performed in the open, before soldiers and citizens alike. He took his eldest son, the heir, the future of his dynasty, and slaughtered him on the walls of the city as a burnt offering. The image is almost unbearable. Flames rising against the sky. The boy's body consumed as his father prayed for deliverance. And according to the biblical account, something extraordinary happened. The allied armies, watching this act of horror, recoiled. The great wrath that followed drove them to withdraw. Mesha's son was dead, but Moab was saved. Here, filicide becomes both horror and strategy. Mesha weaponized his child's death, turning it into psychological warfare. His enemies, repulsed or terrified by the spectacle, abandoned their siege. It worked. The cost was his dynasty, but the reward was survival for him, for his people, for his city. The Mesha Stele, an inscription commissioned by the king himself, does not mention the sacrifice, but it does celebrate his victories and his devotion to the god Chemosh. Perhaps he considered the sacrifice not shameful, but heroic, an act of ultimate devotion. To later readers, it looks less like heroism and more like desperation, disguised as piety. What does this tell us? That filicide can be more than paranoia or cruelty. It can be calculated, deliberate, even effective. Mesha killed his son not because he mistrusted him, not because he saw him as a rival, but because he thought the boy's death could buy divine favor. And in a sense, it did. But it also left behind a legacy that branded Mesha forever as the king who turned his own heir into an offering. And if the Bible preserved the story as a condemnation, history offers no rebuttal. The Moabites eventually disappeared into the tide of conquest, absorbed by larger powers. Mesha's sacrifice may have saved a city, but it did not save a nation. Once again, a father killed his son and lost the future he sought to preserve. But even in far-off Burgundy, centuries later, the same paradox would unfold. A king named Sigismund, a convert to Christianity, would stain his reign with the blood of his son Sigeric. His act would not be remembered as piety, but as madness. Sigismund of Burgundy. Burgundy in the early 6th century was a kingdom caught between worlds. Roman civilization had crumbled, and the new barbarian kingdoms, Franks, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, scrambled to carve up what was left. In this age of flux, Sigismund inherited the throne of Burgundy. He had been raised as an Arian Christian but converted to Catholicism, aligning himself with the new religious powers of Europe. His reign might have been remembered as a step towards stability had it not been for a single devastating act. He murdered his son. The victim was Sigeric, his eldest, a boy of promise and the natural heir. Accounts tell us that a dispute erupted between father and son. Some say it was fueled by Sigismund's new wife, who resented Sigeric and whispered accusations into the king's ear. Others suggest Sigeric openly criticized his father's policies or mocked his father's weakness. Whatever the spark, the fire that followed consumed more than words. Sigismund ordered Sigeric strangled. Not exiled, not disinherited, but strangled, cut off from life, cut off from succession, erased in one violent act. A father who had embraced Christianity, the faith of mercy and forgiveness, responded to his son's insolence with murder. The consequences were swift and brutal. The Franks, ever hungry for territory, invaded Burgundy. Sigismund's guilt weighed on him like a curse. In a bitter twist, he was eventually captured, thrown into a well, and executed alongside his family. His dynasty ended in disgrace, his name remembered not for conversion or piety, but for filicide. The irony here is cutting. Sigismund killed his son to preserve authority, yet that very act destabilized his throne. Instead of strengthening his reign, he hollowed it out. Instead of ensuring succession, he annihilated it. The dynasty's downfall was not written in the stars, it was written in a father's hands around his son's throat. So far, we have seen kings sacrifice sons to gods, to politics, to paranoia, to whispers in the dark. We have seen them burn them, strangle them, suffocate them, force them to suicide. But what comes next is even stranger. For the next figure on our list is not a new king, but a return. a mother emperor whose story we have already glimpsed. Irene of Byzantium, who blinded her son Constantine VI, deserves her own twisted encore, because filicide in her case was not just murder, it was policy, philosophy, and legacy all at once. Irene Addendum. The first time we encountered Irene, it was as the mother who blinded her son in the name of power. That image torches in a Byzantine chamber, eunuchs pinning down the young Emperor Constantine VI, hot irons pressed against his eyes while his mother sat cloaked in authority, was horrific enough. But the truth about Irene is that her filicide was not just an episode. It was the defining act of her reign, the single moment that reframed how history would forever view her. This is why we must return to her, because unlike so many rulers who stumbled into filicide through paranoia or rage, Irene committed it with deliberation, calculation, and the confidence of legality. Byzantium was a machine built on contradiction. It presented itself as a Christian empire, but it functioned as a court of knives and shadows. Irene was no exception. When Constantine VI was born, he was the heir to Leo IV, and therefore the natural continuation of the Isaurian dynasty. Irene, as his mother, was expected to serve as regent until he came of age. But Irene had no interest in relinquishing control. For decades she ruled with him, and then against him, manipulating the clergy, staging councils, and even using the divisive issue of icons, the worship and veneration of holy images, as a weapon. By 797, the power struggle had reached its breaking point. Constantine VI had begun to assert himself, attempting to carve out an identity beyond his mother's shadow. He tried to lead armies, attempted reforms, and sought to rally factions to his cause. To Irene, this was intolerable. Her son wasn't just a rival, he was her undoing. So she made her decision. The choice of blinding was itself deeply Byzantine. Execution of an emperor risked backlash, but blinding, that was the loophole. A blinded emperor was legally unfit to rule. His body disqualified him from the throne, and yet, because his blood had not been spilled, the act could be framed as non-murderous. This was cruelty disguised as piety, a mother's filicide disguised as respect for imperial tradition. The chroniclers were horrified. They did not hesitate to condemn her. They described Irene as a woman who inverted nature itself, destroying her child to enthrone herself. Later, Western writers would use her as an example of the dangers of female sovereignty, as though the sin was not filicide but the arrogance of a woman daring to rule. But even their misogyny cannot erase the raw fact. Irene killed her son not in rage, not in desperation, but with cold intent. After Constantine's blinding, Irene declared herself not Empress, but Emperor. She adopted the masculine title Basileus, claiming the throne as hers alone. For 5 years she ruled, the first woman in Byzantine history to do so openly. Her reign was marked by diplomacy with Charlemagne, attempts to stabilize the church, and the usual palace intrigue. But none of it mattered. History had already written its verdict. Irene was the woman who killed her son for a crown. Her story is a mirror held up to all the others on our list. Constantine the Great killed Crispus in secrecy, tormented by rumor. Ivan the Terrible killed his son in rage, broken by guilt. Suleiman strangled Mustafa in a tent, consumed by suspicion. Irene, however, executed her son's future with legal precision and ruled in his place, unapologetically. That is why she belongs here twice, because she represents not just the act of filicide, but its normalization, its institutionalization, its transformation into imperial policy. But if Irene's second telling reveals the cold, legalistic side of filicide, the next return to our list reveals something else, sheer scale. Because while Irene killed one son, Herod the Great killed 3. And the second time we look at him, It is not just as a paranoid king of Judea, but as the very archetype of the father who could never stop murdering his children. Herod Addendum. The story of Herod has already been told once, but it deserves to be told again because his filicide was not an isolated crime. It was a pattern, a rhythm of paranoia that consumed his dynasty. Herod killed Alexander. He killed Aristobulus IV. And he killed Antipater. 3 sons, 3 deaths, each reflecting a different facet of a king's fear. Alexander was youthful promise, the son of Mariamne, Herod's Hasmonean queen. To Herod's subjects, Alexander symbolized legitimacy, a return to the dynasty that had ruled Judea before Rome imposed its puppet. But Herod could not abide competition. His jealousy of Mariamne's beauty, his insecurity over his own origins, his fear of Rome's suspicion, all of it combined into lethal suspicion. So Alexander died. Aristobulus IV was different, less of a shining star than his brother, but still dangerous, still too much of a Hasmonean. He too fell under Herod's strangling hand. And then came Antipater. The irony of Antipater's fate is bitter beyond measure. For years, he had manipulated his father, spreading lies about his half-brothers, whispering poison into Herod's ear. It worked. He survived while they perished. He positioned himself as heir, basking in his father's favor. And then, when it seemed victory was, his Herod turned on him. Accusations of conspiracy surfaced, and Antipater was executed mere days before Herod himself died. It is almost theatrical, the father who kills all his sons only to die with no heir he can trust. The dynasty he tried so desperately to secure was left unstable, splintered among the surviving children who inherited not power but suspicion. Herod's line limped forward, its glory spent. Herod's story belongs twice on this list because it encapsulates the essence of filicide and monarchy. The first telling shows us the acts themselves. The second shows us their cumulative weight, how the repeated killing of sons transforms a family tree into a stump, and how paranoia becomes a dynasty's inheritance. Herod didn't just murder his children, he murdered his own legacy. And if Herod shows us repetition, the next return on our list shows us reflection. Constantine the Great killed Crispus, and history judged him both as a saint and a murderer. To revisit, Constantine is to see the contradiction sharpened, how one man can be remembered as the savior of an empire and the destroyer of his son in the same breath. Constantine Addendum. Constantine's filicide has already haunted us once, but the story refuses to die because it sits at the intersection of sainthood and sin. Crispus, the brilliant general, beloved by soldiers, executed on his father's orders. Fausta, the stepmother, suffocated in a hot bath soon after. And Constantine, the emperor who baptized Rome into Christianity, left with blood on his hands that no baptism could wash away. Why revisit this story? Because Constantine represents the paradox in its purest form. He is canonized by the Orthodox Church, venerated as equal to the apostles. Statues of him stand in churches. His vision of the cross before battle is recited in sermons. And yet, this saint executed his son. How does one reconcile these two truths? The answer is simple. You don't. History doesn't reconcile. It records. The killing of Crispus is maddeningly opaque. Was it Fausta's manipulation? Was it Crispus's own ambition? Was it Constantine's paranoia? Historians debate endlessly, but the sources refuse to give clarity. This ambiguity is what makes the story so powerful. It isn't just a crime, it's a riddle. A riddle that reveals the nature of power itself. It thrives on ambiguity, on records destroyed, on rumors whispered, until they become truth. And Constantine's sainthood only sharpens the irony. The church that forgave him did so because of his political utility. He was the emperor who gave Christianity legitimacy, who ended persecution, who convened councils that defined orthodoxy. His filicide was brushed aside because it was inconvenient. Saints, it seems, are allowed to kill their sons so long as they also serve the institution. That is why Constantine belongs here twice, because his story forces us to confront a truth we'd rather avoid. Morality bends for power. A man can kill his child and still be worshipped on stained glass. A ruler can strangle the very blood that gave him continuity and still be called the Great. And yet, Constantine is only one voice in this chorus. To see the chorus more fully, we must turn again to Russia, where another great ruler repeated the same crime. Peter the Great, who built a modern empire, killed his son Alexei. And in the retelling of his story, we see not just cruelty but the deliberate bureaucratization of filicide. Peter the Great Addendum. Peter the Great has already stood trial in our litany of fathers who killed their sons, but one pass over his story isn't enough. To mention once that Alexei Petrovich was destroyed by his father's will is to skim the surface of something much deeper. Peter's filicide was not a single event. It was the climax of an ongoing tragedy, one that reveals the contradiction of a man who wanted to drag Russia into the future, yet sabotaged that very future with his own hands. Alexei Petrovich was not his father's reflection. Where Peter loved ships and cannons and European innovations, Alexei gravitated toward the old Muscovite ways, prayer, ritual, tradition. Where Peter stormed across battlefields, Alexei shrank from conflict. Where Peter devoured change with ferocity, Alexei resisted it, quietly aligning himself with conservative nobles and priests who hated his father's reforms. For Peter, this was not just disappointment, it was betrayal. He had spent his life remaking Russia, and his son seemed determined to unmake it. Peter's torment was that he could not force Alexei into becoming the heir he wanted. He tried threats, insults, humiliation. He sent letters dripping with venom, calling his son worthless, accusing him of treachery. But instead of breaking Alexei into obedience, he broke him into despair. Eventually, Alexei fled abroad into the arms of Austria, seeking safety from the wrath of his own father. For Peter, this was unforgivable. A son who turned to foreigners was no son at all. He was a traitor. When Alexei was lured back to Russia with promises of mercy, those promises evaporated quickly. He was put on trial for treason, interrogated and tortured. The confessions he gave, whether coerced or not, sealed his fate. In 1718, before his execution could be staged, Alexei died in prison. Officially, it was illness. In reality, it was the aftermath of beatings ordered under his father's authority. The horror of Peter's crime is its bureaucratic coldness. Unlike Ivan the Terrible's impulsive strike against his son, Peter cloaked his filicide in legal formality. He convened a trial, gathered evidence, and signed decrees. He turned a father's rage into state procedure, as though paperwork could sanitize patricide. The modern Russia he was building, a Russia of codes, courts, and reforms, was used to mask the same old dynastic paranoia. And what was the result? The Russia Peter left behind was weaker, not stronger. Without Alexei, the succession became a chaos of daughters, grandchildren, and manipulated heirs. Peter wanted a son who would carry forward his reforms. Instead, he ensured that his line collapsed into confusion. He wanted to secure Russia's modernization, but he planted the seeds of instability. His empire survived, yes, but it did so in spite of his filicide, not because of it. To revisit Peter's story is to see the paradox more clearly. A ruler who claimed to love progress but murdered his own progress embodied in his son. A ruler who claimed to love order but destroyed the natural order of succession. A ruler called the Great who committed one of the smallest, meanest acts imaginable, the killing of his own child. If Peter shows us the cold rationalization of filicide, the next return shows us the theatrical cruelty of it. For Mithridates VI of Pontus, the act was not hidden in legal ceremony. It was public, brutal, and grotesque, the kind of filicide meant to send a message to enemies as much as to kin. Mithridates Addendum. Mithridates VI is one of antiquity's great villains and heroes, depending on who tells the story. To the Romans, he was the barbarian king who challenged their might across the Black Sea, a poison eater, a trickster, a threat. To his own people, he was a defender against foreign domination, a monarch who resisted Rome's encroachment. But even legends cannot escape the darker truths of their reigns, and in Mithridates' case, the darkness took the form of a son named Zephyrus. Zephyrus was caught in a family drama that could only end in tragedy. His mother, Stratonice, betrayed Mithridates by siding with the Romans during the wars. Zephyrus, whether out of loyalty to his mother or calculation, joined her. To Mithridates, this was the ultimate treachery, his son not only disobedient, but aligned with his greatest enemy. Mithridates' reaction was not subtle. He had Zephyrus killed. Some accounts suggest he did it personally. Others say he ensured the death was public, grotesque, and humiliating. The details blur in the haze of propaganda, but the core fact remains: he murdered his son to punish betrayal and to demonstrate that no bond, not even blood, could protect a traitor. The cruelty of the act is sharpened by its context. Mithridates was a man obsessed with poisons, with immunity, with surviving assassination attempts. He dosed himself daily with toxins, training his body to resist what might kill others. And yet, for all his paranoia, he could not immunize himself against the betrayal of his own child. Poison-proof, but not betrayal-proof. The death of Zephyrus reveals the theatrical side of Mithridates' rule. It was not just about eliminating a rival, it was about putting on a show for both his enemies and his allies. By killing his son, he was sending a message: if I can do this to my own child, imagine what I can do to you. In this way, filicide became a weapon of statecraft, as much performance as punishment. But the performance carried a cost. Rome did not tremble at Zephyrus' death. Rome did not retreat. Rome marched on, crushing Mithridates and eventually swallowing his kingdom. The son was dead, the father disgraced, the dynasty obliterated. The king who thought killing his child would secure his power instead destroyed both his family and his throne. Mithridates belongs twice in our story because he embodies the extremes of royal filicide. Once, we see him as a father lashing out at betrayal. In the retelling, we see him as a man staging his son's death as theatre, using filicide as propaganda. In both cases, the irony is unbearable. The man who dosed himself against poison poisoned his own dynasty with paranoia. And if Mithridates shows us theatre, the next return shows us ritual. For in Persia, centuries earlier, Artaxerxes II had executed his son Darius not in a fit of rage, not as spectacle for the masses, but as a ritual cleansing of conspiracy. Artaxerxes II Addendum. The Achaemenid Empire was vast, stretching across deserts, mountains, and fertile valleys. Its wealth measured in tribute, and its armies drawn from every corner of the known world. But at its heart, like every empire, it was a family business, and family businesses are always the most dangerous. Artaxerxes II, one of Persia's longest reigning kings, had ruled through decades of intrigue. His son Darius, however, proved one intrigue too many. Darius was not just a son. He was the eldest son, the heir apparent, the one expected to inherit the throne. But ambition is dangerous in a palace where the father still breathes. Darius grew impatient. He conspired with courtiers, plotted against his father, perhaps even raised the prospect of overthrow. Whether these plots were real or exaggerated by rivals, Artaxerxes saw them as threat enough. The punishment was death. Some sources claim Artaxerxes executed him with his own hand, cutting his throat in a symbolic act of purging betrayal. If true, this is filicide taken to its starkest form. The father who gives life with one hand and takes it with the other, personally. It was not just a political decision, but a ritual cleansing, an emperor proving that even his firstborn could not stand against him. In the ritualistic cruelty of Persian punishment flayings, impalements, mutilations, the death of Darius stands out precisely because it was intimate. This was not a faceless criminal on the empire's edge. This was blood of his blood, flesh of his flesh, the child who was supposed to carry the dynasty forward. By killing him, Artaxerxes was saying, "The dynasty does not pass through bloodlines. It passes through me and me alone." The irony is that the empire he preserved by killing his son did not last. Within a century, Alexander the Great swept through Persia, shattering the Achaemenid dynasty. Darius's death had secured nothing except a temporary extension of his father's reign. The succession remained unstable, the dynasty weakened by the absence of a strong heir. This is why Artaxerxes belongs here twice. Once, his story reveals the execution of an impatient heir. Told again, it reveals the ritualistic nature of filicide, the way it becomes a performance of sovereignty. Killing a son is not just about eliminating a rival, it is about proving that even the sacred bond of fatherhood can be annihilated by the throne. And so, with Irene, Herod, Constantine, Peter, Mithridates, and Artaxerxes all revisited, we see the same themes in sharper relief. Legality, paranoia, theater, ritual. But our grim procession continues. Next in line is Tigranes of Armenia once more, whose story, told again, reveals how filicide becomes not just an act, but a dynasty's pattern of self-destruction. Tigranes Addendum. When we first met Tigranes II of Armenia, he was the conqueror who had carved an empire from the cracks between Rome and Parthia, only to stain his dynasty with the blood of his children. To revisit him is to look deeper into the paradox of a king who wanted an heir strong enough to defend Armenia, yet feared those very heirs once they grew into men. His filicide is worth a second telling not only because of the act itself, but because of the haunting symbolism, Armenia's fleeting greatness undone not by foreign armies, but by a father's knife turned inward. The chronicles describe Tigranes as a man whose ambition matched his suspicions. He spent his life building an empire of cities, trade routes, alliances, and armies. He dreamed of Armenia as something more than a buffer state. He dreamed of it as the third great power of the ancient world. But ambition does not coexist peacefully with sons. Princes grow restless under the weight of their father's crowns. They want to inherit sooner, or they are courted by factions who whisper that the king has grown old, soft, distracted. Tigranes' sons, whether one or several, the records differ, fell into this trap. They rebelled, and so he executed them. A father who had fought for decades against Rome and Parthia, who negotiated with generals and emperors, who withstood sieges and betrayal, turned his fury not outward, but inward. His sons were put to death, and in doing so he pruned away the branches of his own dynasty. The tragedy here is not just that he killed his children, but that he killed his children at the very moment Armenia most needed them. The empire he had built was already straining under Roman pressure. Pompey the Great, one of Rome's leading generals, had already marched east to cut Armenia down to size. If Tigranes had had strong heirs, they might have rallied resistance, preserved fragments of independence, or at least negotiated from a position of strength. Instead, by killing his sons, Tigranes ensured that Armenia's future was weaker than its present. The second telling of Tigranes' filicide thus reveals its irony more sharply. He killed his sons to secure his throne, but in doing so, he destroyed the very continuity that might have carried his legacy. He built an empire only to leave behind a hollow shell, a reminder that conquest means nothing if there is no one left to inherit it. And that pattern, murdering one's children in the name of survival, only to undermine survival, finds its most grotesque expression in Egypt. Which brings us again to Ptolemy VIII, the king whose filicide was not just murder but mutilation, a performance of cruelty so vivid that it burned itself into history. Ptolemy VIII Addendum. The Ptolemies of Egypt were notorious for turning family life into blood sport, and Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, or the Fat, perfected the game. The first telling of his crime shocked us, the murder of his son Ptolemy Memphites, dismembered and sent to his mother Cleopatra II as a grotesque birthday present. But it is worth revisiting, because the act wasn't just cruelty. It was a declaration of what the Ptolemaic dynasty had become, a house so consumed by incest, jealousy, and paranoia that children were no longer heirs but hostages. Cleopatra II, his sister wife, had rebelled against him, allying with their daughter Cleopatra III and raising Alexandria against his rule. Ptolemy, driven into exile, struck back in the only way he knew how, through the destruction of family. Memphites, his young son with Cleopatra II, was seized. The boy was still a teenager, still innocent of the tangled politics of his parents' feud. But innocence never mattered in Ptolemaic politics. Blood was blood, and therefore useful as a weapon. Memphites was executed, his body cut to pieces, each limb packaged and delivered to Cleopatra II. It was not just filicide, it was theatre. Imagine the horror of opening a parcel, expecting tribute or surrender terms, and finding instead the fragments of your child. Ptolemy VIII weaponized fatherhood itself, turning his son's body into a political message. The act reveals the depth of dysfunction in the Ptolemaic house. The dynasty had long relied on incestuous marriages to preserve its bloodline, creating a court where sisters were wives, nephews were sons-in-law, and every child was entangled in webs of competing loyalties. In such a system, sons became pawns, their lives weighed not against affection but against political utility. Memphites was valuable not as an heir but as a corpse, his death more useful to his father than his life. The irony of Physcon's reign is that while he ruled for nearly 3 decades, his dynasty staggered ever closer to collapse. By the time Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra of Antony and Caesar, appeared, the Ptolemies were little more than Roman clients. The murder of Memphites symbolized the rot at the dynasty's core, a house so consumed by internecine violence that it made Rome look stable by comparison. The second telling of Physcon's crime, then, is not just about the death of Memphites. It is about the transformation of filicide into spectacle, about the way cruelty becomes propaganda. It shows us how dynasties collapse not from foreign invasion, but from fathers who think their children's bodies are weapons to be brandished. And if Egypt gives us theatre, Morocco gives us scale. For Moulay Ismail did not kill just one son, but many, treating his vast brood as disposable, as though fatherhood itself were simply a matter of arithmetic. Moulay Ismail Addendum. Moulay Ismail of Morocco has already appeared once in our story, but his cruelty was too vast to confine to a single telling. Known as the Warrior King, he reigned from 1672 to 1727, one of the longest reigns in history. He was also one of the most prolific fathers the world has ever seen, said to have sired hundreds of children with his enormous harem. If most kings saw their heirs as precious, Ismail saw his as surplus. He treated sons not as blessings but as threats, waiting to blossom. Zetian was executed. Muhammad Alim was mutilated until he ended his own life. Others met quieter deaths, struck down by their father's paranoia or sacrificed to preserve his sense of control. Where other rulers killed one son and mourned, Ismail killed many and barely blinked. Why? Because to him, sons were not individuals, they were statistics. With so many heirs, there was always another to replace the one lost. If one son showed defiance, he could be eliminated without remorse. If another aligned with a faction, he could be punished as an example. In a perverse way, Ismail's filicide became a management strategy. He pruned his family tree like a gardener cutting diseased branches, forgetting that too much pruning kills the tree altogether. His cruelty extended beyond his family. His empire was maintained through slave armies, forced labor, and the kind of brutality that made even foreign observers blanch. European ambassadors wrote of his savagery, his quick temper, his casual executions. Yet even they noted that his treatment of his own children was especially chilling. Fathers were supposed to nurture. Ismail annihilated. The result was predictable. When he finally died in 1727, Morocco was plunged into chaos. Dozens of sons claimed the throne, each backed by factions, each suspicious of the others. Civil war erupted, and the dynasty weakened. Ismail had thought himself eternal, but by killing and mutilating his children, he left behind only instability. The second telling of Ismail's story thus shows us scale rather than detail. If Herod killed 3 sons, if Constantine killed one, if Ptolemy mutilated another, Ismail turned filicide into policy. It was no longer an act of desperation or passion, it was routine. And that routinization is perhaps the most chilling revelation of all. When killing one's children becomes as ordinary as signing decrees, monarchy has crossed the line into monstrosity. And yet, even with all this horror, our parade of filicidal rulers is not finished. Next comes the return to Ethiopia, where Zara Yaqob's zealotry burned so hot that even the bonds of blood were consumed as sacrifices to orthodoxy.